Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni wanji, namaste, jumbo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We are coming to you from the beautiful city of Macon in the state of Georgia. We are delighted and so very honored that you are joining us in our mission to help families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Stitcher Radio, wherever you find your podcasts. Our guest today is Michelle Lee. She is here to celebrate a very Asian guide to Korean food. Before we invite our guests into the studio, we want to invite you to join us at the Orange County Children's Book Festival in Costa Mesa, California on October 2nd. The Orange County Children's Book Festival is the largest children's book festival in North America. It's incredible! There are hundreds of authors, all sorts of totally interactive shows. We'll be there with our booth. You get to meet me. You get to meet some of the books that we've celebrated here on the podcast. You get to be part of our totally interactive family magic show. And we're going to be looking for some great families to interview to be part of a future episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Easier said than done. Reading with Your Kids podcast. It's fun. It's easy. It's free admission. October 2nd, the Orange County Children's Book Festival. Come on down. Oh, I have a feeling this is going to be a delicious interview. I can't wait. Joining us right now from St. Louis in Missouri. Our guest is here today to celebrate her book. It's called A Very Asian Guide to Korean Food. Please welcome to the show, Michelle Lee. Hey, Michelle, how are you?
Hi. Oh, my gosh. Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
I'm delighted to have you on, and I have to tell you, I'm not real familiar with Korean food. I'm familiar with lots of other food from lots of other Asian countries, but Korea is not one of those countries. So I need you to guide me.
Well, I'll make sure that you get a copy of the book. How about that?
That sounds great. Well, tell us about the book.
Well, the book is really a very simple, very Asian guide to Korean food. We put it together because of a viral moment that happened to me in January and kind of became the, the seed to start a foundation. And so now the book. Basically, someone in January, I work in local news, and so I was doing a story on what Americans eat on New Year's Day. And, growing up in Missouri and even living in the South, not everyone has a New Year's Day food tradition. Do you?
We have a New Year's Eve tradition, which is Chinese food.
Oh, nice. Yeah. I love it. Sometimes it's our Christmas tradition too for not planning well. But yeah, so I work on the news and I'm a news anchor and reporter, and I said, traditionally Americans eat greens for wealth or pork for progress. Kind of like a Southern really dinner. Having lived in North Carolina, I was like, I ate this a lot in North Carolina. And then at the end of the story, the 20-second story, I just said, and I had dumpling soup because that's what a lot of Korean people eat. And so right away I had a couple of really nice comments like, oh, my wife grew up in Korea. Our daughter's making this soup for the first time. And I had another nice tweet that was like, hey, our young people see that. That's cool representation. I mean, I thought it was a pretty inclusive moment for a 20-second story. But then I got a voicemail from a woman who called and said, I'm just kind of offended because if white people talked about what white people ate, they would get fired. And Michelle was being very Asian, and she just needs to keep her Korean to herself and talk about what white people eat. And so I was kind of shocked. I had a lot of emotions actually, but I shared that. It ended up going viral around the world. We did a big fundraiser using the hashtag Very Asian. Ended up on the Ellen DeGeneres show. Ellen gave me $15,000, and I thought, well, what am I going to do with this money? And had been already talking to a few people, and the immediate response was, well, let's put the money into a foundation. So then we have the foundation called the Very Asian Foundation, and then here we are with the very Asian guide to Korean food.
Wow, there's so much to unpack. First,
Yeah.
I mean, I can't even begin to talk about the level of dumbness that comment was. I'm sorry.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. You know what? It's interesting because I did talk to the woman later. People, I don't know if they have bad days, if they really feel that way, if they have moments where they, are deeply regretful. I don't know that woman's name. Mm-hmm. I still never have been able to share her identity, and I don't want to. So I felt like it was kind of a learning lesson for us all, right? And I don't begrudge her. In fact, when I went super viral, I wanted to make sure that she didn't get, quote unquote canceled, right, because that's something I don't believe in either, yeah, cancel culture. But it's interesting. I will say this because I'm adopted. So I grew up in Missouri. I'm a Midwestern girl. My parents are white. My husband's white. My child is mixed race, and in St. Louis and in the Midwest, there's a lot of community building and solidarity as well. Like we just, I think that whether you are quote unquote very Asian or not at all, we all have a right to bring our humanity to our spaces. And so anytime we even learn about culture, even if we had, let's say, Korean parents don't guarantee that you're going to learn culture. I have a lot of friends who grew up and said, my parents didn't teach me language, or they didn't teach me how to cook because they just were too busy, or they wanted me to assimilate, into, or I just wanted to be like every other kid. I didn't want to do this, or learn this. So, I think no matter who we are, we have to be very intentional about what we're bringing into our lives. Mm-hmm. My husband has a Polish grandfather who immigrated here, and his whole family, none of his family speaks Polish anymore, so there's always this intention when we go to any festival, a Polish festival, or, his Dutch heritage, or, now my Korean heritage. It's a lifetime of learning. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's where we are with the book.
Well, I love the idea of the book. I love when you were talking about dumpling soup. It just immediately brought back a memory. We've hosted international kids here in our home, and a number of the kids that we've hosted that have become part of our family are from China. Yeah. And one of my Chinese daughters from a city named Zhejiang in China taught me how to make dumplings from scratch.
Nice.
It took all day long. Absolutely. My wife comes in after 2 hours. She goes, you can get those wrappers at the supermarket, but it's like, it won't be as good as us rolling this stuff out. And
right.
And it's just such a wonderful experience and a wonderful memory. And food has that kind of magical ability to bring people together, I think, and to create memories.
Absolutely. I mean, so much of our lives is centered around food. If you think about how we celebrate, we eat. How we mourn, we eat. If we're feeling lonely, we eat. There are so many things that our lives really center about the food that we eat. So, or center around the food that we eat. So, in Korean tradition as well, so much is about food, and it's really about the labor-intensive process of creating the food. We do dumplings as well. And I will say, I just told you I'm adopted, but in the 90s, I met my entire birth family. Oh. So, I'm in connection with my Korean parents who are still married. And then I have 3 sisters as well. And I actually helped one of my sisters immigrate to the United States. So she lives in Texas. In fact, I always joke, I kind of helped her meet her husband because I put her on a dating app and she met her husband that way. So, she's so happy, and she is so great, for me because she's like my Korean encyclopedia and my Google machine. I just say, hey, what about this? And she has really taught me a lot about Korean culture. And then I've gone to Korea several times. Mm-hmm. So she gave a lot of great input to this book as well, because I would say, I really like kimbap. Can we put this in? Which is, it kind of looks like sushi, I guess, if you weren't familiar with it. Mm-hmm. But, usually it's like Spam or some sort of, usually Spam, eggs, radish, rice, carrots, I think. Depends on, now I'm like blanking out. But then you roll it up in seaweed and rice, and it's so good. And what usually people end up doing is taking it on school picnics. Like, it's a really big thing that kids remember taking to school picnics in Korea. So we added that little line in the book, and she said, "Oh my gosh, I remember doing that every summer." And we would also, bring extra for our teachers and all that kind of stuff. So she has some really incredible input in the book. And then we also put in a lot of fusion dishes like Korean tacos and, which are like, who doesn't like a taco, right? And Korean fried chicken, so those are fun things to add.
That sounds really fun. Now, the book is the book a traditional cookbook, or is it a picture book, storybook? Picture book. When we wrote the book, we came up with we identified the foods that we wanted to add to the book. And of course it's like, puppies, like I left out some of my favorite puppies in the book as well. But then I was just so impressed with our illustrator, Rebecca, because she brought it to life and it was incredible. And I loved her illustrations. They were funky and fun and they felt really fresh to me. And, some people are visual readers. Mm-hmm. And so I thought that this was a really great way to introduce the food. And just having Rebecca being Korean, Canadian, she has the opportunity to really know the food as well and give her own input. One of the things we encourage families to do, especially with certain books, is to take a picture walk through the book before they read the story. Just sit down and look at the pictures together and guess, what do you think might be happening here? What do you think this is? What do you think that is? And it's a really fun way to experience the book because parents are always complaining, I have to read this book for the 500th time. Right. Well, you don't have to read it the same way every time. There's different ways to experience a book. Yeah, and we do that now, especially because my son is 3. So it's, always about the pictures. It's always about like, what do you think they're thinking? Or what do you think that is? What are they doing there? And it's incredible because he will remember the way he feels about the pages. And he will end up reciting things or telling his own stories, So sometimes in some books he will be able to, kind of memorize. And so he mimics reading, which I love. But then also when he doesn't do that, I love how his imagination takes off because he's looking at the images and coming up with his own stories. So it really feels like an experience, when you get to walk through the book and look at the illustrations first. And I'm really hoping that when he sees the book, that he will be able to see how shareable food is, how approachable it is, even though we wouldn't probably say approachable, but just that it looks like a regular, a regular American dinner, shared among people that you love. So I'm really hoping that he sees that. Yeah. So it's obvious the benefits that your son is going to, get from reading a very Asian guide to Korean food, to see the foods that are on his table, oftentimes represented in the pages of the book. But what about other kids from white families, African-American families? What's the benefit for them to kind of look through the window of the book to see these dishes? Well, I think it's a really easy, win for families, all people, because they get a chance to not only see themselves in some cases, right, like my son maybe, but also to learn about others. And a lot of times the only way we get to learn, or should say the first way we get to learn about a culture is through food. So you might see something on the page and go, oh, that looks interesting, or oh, that looks like something I really want to eat, like bingsu, for example, which is kind of like halo halo or like, a shaved ice with a lot of different ingredients. It is so delicious. And you might not know that that is a Korean dessert. And you might go, oh, wait, but this is kind of like ice cream, or this is kind of like something else I had. Oh, wait, this isn't scary. It isn't scary to put beans on this, ice cream dish. So to me, it feels like it makes it more approachable because you can see it and then you go, oh, this isn't scary. Oh, this isn't stinky. Oh, this looks like I want to try this. A lot of us in the Asian American community talk about
And I didn't have this experience because I was adopted, but a lot of people talk about remembering bringing their school lunches and getting made fun of because it was so stinky or it was weird. And really that is such a trigger for so many adults my age, because it was traumatizing. They didn't want to be different. And so even now we see, people my age now with kids trying to not relive those experiences for their own children. And, we always say, like, don't yuck our yum, And I think it's so important because I just think that kids should be allowed to truly enjoy what they like eating, and also being able to spread empathy and awareness throughout our communities so that kids can support each other. My kid loves seaweed, loves dried seaweed. And so we always try to give it to his friends. And you can see some of the older kids will go, yuck, that's disgusting, And I always say, no, it's not disgusting. It's different to you, but give it a try. And some kids end up really liking it. And then, some kids are really, the younger ones especially, are really sweet. And they'll say, no, I don't like that, or, oh, I love that, I just think it teaches understanding and empathy and compassion at such a young age. Yeah. So, I'm hoping that whoever reads the book, even adults, would go, oh my gosh, I don't think that's so intimidating now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, as somebody who's tried seaweed, it's not my favorite thing in the world, but it's not yucky.
Well, thanks.
Yeah.
You know what? I will say, if you get the dry, the seaweed in the little packets and you put it in a ball of rice, oh my gosh, nothing compares. But I'm not a big seaweed, in soups kind of person. Uh-huh. And when you have a baby, if you have a baby, a lot of Korean people will suggest that you eat seaweed soup, nonstop, to help, replenish, all the things that you lost during childbirth. And so my sister came over and tried to make the soup for me, and you eat it for 30 days. And I was like, I can't do it. So, I understand, there are some things that I don't like, and I'm a Korean born person. I'm not going to like everything. And that is okay too.
Yeah. Well, you bring up a good point, because I think one of the things that we should teach our kids is it's really rude to look at something somebody's eating and go, yuck, that's disgusting.
Yeah.
Oh,
it's damaging. I mean, it really does make you feel like, well, maybe I'm a weirdo then, or but then you secretly, not secretly, but you love this food, or it's a part of your heritage or your culture. So you're like, gosh, or, it just might be the simple fact that you are embarrassed. You don't want to be embarrassed, But I remember I brought kimchi to my newsroom once, and someone was like, that is disgusting. Get that out of here. You're stinking up the whole newsroom. And I remember being super embarrassed about it. And I thought, gosh, I'm 30 something, still dealing with this. But yes, in reality, kimchi is a really strong smell. So maybe I should have put it in the lunchroom. But I was like, no shame. I'm doing it.
Hey, a couple of things I want to ask you about. First is, you've been very open in sharing that, you're Korean born, but you were adopted by an American family. And we hear, I've heard some different things about a lot of people aren't in favor of that. It's like the transracial adoption, and it's not the best idea. How do you feel about that? What's your take on that?
Sure. You know what? I think it's a very individual thing, and I can understand where people are coming from, because not all adoptions are peachy keen. Some people have been adopted in families that maybe weren't right for adoption. And adoption is trauma. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think in many ways we have glamorized international adoption, or not we. I mean, I didn't, but I think communities have glamorized international adoption. But the truth is, I don't see anything glamorous about being in foster care or an orphanage, or being, when I was adopted, my birth father did not know that I was relinquished. And that is something that my birth mother and my birth father have had to come to terms with. And, they're still married, so they have. But, what a difficult situation that must have been for my mother to live that life all by herself, knowing that she had done that. And then for my father to not know at all, and then suddenly find out that he had a daughter. So, adoption is trauma. And even when you are dealing with, adoptive parents, there is usually some sort of loss there too. That's, adoption typically isn't a first, choice necessarily. And then there are some, I will say this, there are some parents who have, said things like, we just want to help all the children, who need homes and we want to adopt. And I always say to people, that is a terrible thing to say to an adoptee. Because I want someone to be, if they're going to adopt, I want them to be selfish about it. I want them to say, like, I want to be somebody's parent because I want to love a child. Mm-hmm. Not like, oh, this little kid there are so many kids who need help in the world. That's like adopting a pet. Mm-hmm. You need to be selfish about, I want to be a parent. I want to love this child. That's just my opinion, So adoption is really tricky. And even people my age, I think this is a really important topic. People who are my age, have a risk of being deported. And I find that so even more terrible because, if you were born or adopted into the country after a certain year, I believe it was 2000, under the Child Act of 2000, you would automatically become a citizen. But if you were adopted before then you had to go through the naturalization process. You're considered an immigrant, which I am, considered an immigrant on my paperwork. My parents had to, do all the citizenship stuff so that I could become a naturalized citizen. And some kids who got adopted adults failed them somewhere, or maybe they were adopted into a bad family and had to be, removed from the home. Mm-hmm. So there are incidents like that. And there have been adoptees who have only known the United States their entire life and have been deported back to their origin countries. And I feel like that is so shameful and terrible that that's happened to people and that there are people still at risk of that in our country. That's a long story.
No. That's a horrific thing. In fact, I saw a movie about that subject not too long ago, and the idea that you could be raised to come here as an infant and raised here, and then suddenly in your 30s or 40s, deported to a country that you had never been to before is just horrifying.
Well, and a lot of times you can't work because you have to have either a family registry or a social security card or something like that you can't just get. Mm-hmm. And then also you don't know the language or the culture. I mean, I can't even imagine just being plucked from your life and then dropped off into the middle of a place that you've never experienced before. And so, and then there's also this feeling, and not always, but like, we used to say this, and I'm sure that this is not, the words that you would use now, but like I remember being, my first trip to Korea, people would say, well, once you're an orphan, you're always an orphan, and so sometimes that was the, attitude that Koreans would have against, adoptees. I can't really say that that's, the right way to say things now, but you know what I mean? So there's always a stigma that you carry as well. And so basically I will say this, I have been to enough like unwed mothers' homes, orphanages, done a lot of work in the post-adoption community internationally. And so adoption, even if you stopped adoption, it doesn't stop babies from being born. And I would say I love my family and I wouldn't change my life at all. But that doesn't mean adoption is easy for me. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that I don't have bad days. And I 100% support other adoptees who are on their own journey and may not have had, an experience that they, have felt was supportive or, or even positive. Right. So I just always support everyone's own journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, there certainly is. I love to salute families who choose to adopt, families who choose to be foster families.
Yes.
It is necessary. There's, I think, 400,000 kids on any given day, 400,000 kids in the foster care system, and that is 400,000 too many.
Yeah. 100%. And I also, I love anyone who wants to have a heart for children in the foster care system in the United States. I mean, I've done a lot of work in that space too. And that is just certainly a lot of ups and downs, lots of hard work and commitment, so I just think anything that we can do positively for children is great. And obviously, just being in news, I know that there are a lot of incidents and a lot of kids that still fall through the cracks. That just happens, and I hate it. Yeah. But that's a reality that we all have to work towards finding solutions.
Yeah. Hey, one last question before you've mentioned that you're in the news media, and one of the things that I think is real important for families as they're reading with their kids, it's a great way to start helping our kids become media literate, to understand that media, that TV shows and books are created by someone. That person had an intention when they created it. How can we, and nowadays, unlike me, like 100 years ago, there was 3 channels that I watched on TV, and there was a couple of newspapers here in Boston. Now kids and adults are just bombarded with information coming from us from all different angles through all these different devices. How can we best teach our kids to be discerning and to look and know what sources of information they can trust?
Oh my goodness. I think that's a real big question and a real big struggle that I have not only as a journalist, but as a mother, and I sit there on Instagram and TikTok and scroll and scroll and scroll. And I think about like, oh my gosh, some content is so good out there, and then some is very questionable, and some is just downright false. And I think that is the hardest thing, because you really have to be engaged in your child's life to know what content is out there, what the messaging is, who's creating it. And it's almost impossible. I mean, really, I always have said this in journalism spaces, like our platforms need to be regulated just as much as television and radio. We have to follow FCC guidelines. We have to, put up closed captioning. We have to do certain things if there's a tornado in the area. There's all these certain things that we are mandated to do. And I think it legitimizes our industry. And I do think that local news especially is so important, because CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, they're not going to cover the tornado in your area until it's over, right? Like, they're not going to be forecasting on the flash flooding that's happening or the hurricane. They swoop in afterwards. Or more importantly, they're not going to tell you where your tax money is going, or what your schools are teaching. They might come in and sweep in and do a story on critical race theory or something. But I'm saying, like, if you really want to be engaged in your community and the content that it's accessible to you locally, you have to invest in local news. We all understand local businesses keep our communities going. I really do think we need more support in the local news space, because that's where you get your first taste of seeing someone who looks like you, or hearing the stories of your neighbors. I always say there are Asian Americans existing in every single city in the United States. But so often our stories are told through the lens of New York or San Francisco or Los Angeles, where the majority of the population lives outside of those cities. So to me, it's like, when you see that, and then at the same time you see the Asian American Journalists Association did a study and looked at the top 20 news markets, which would include Boston. And they found that the Asian American population, like the news anchors, were grossly underrepresented on television. And so when I see that, I think of all the families and the kids who don't see that in their own communities. So then they grow up thinking that maybe they don't exist, or maybe that, or if you're an Asian American kid, you go, well, maybe that's not for me, or maybe I can't even be in that space. And so that's going a little bit, off of what you were saying, but, in terms of like finding information and finding content. I think you have to do a little bit of both, but I think so much starts locally, finding out what your local library is up to, finding out, the stories that are being covered in your local news, and demanding, more coverage, more widespread coverage and equitable coverage. But yeah, oh my gosh, in terms of the internet, it's the wild, wild west. Sometimes we'll put on, put on YouTube and I don't have YouTube Kids on or something. I'll just have YouTube on, and then suddenly, I'll look up and I'm like, what is that video? So I'm like, oh my gosh, it's hard. It is really hard to be engaged because it's like drinking water from a fire hydrant a lot of times.
Yeah, it really is. And I'm glad you reminded us. It's really important for us to consume media with our kids and to be there with them, to talk about it with them. And one of the great pieces of media, a great book that kids and families can consume together, is A Very Asian Guide to Korean Food. Michelle, where can we go to find out more about the book and to find out more about your foundation, I think?
Yeah, so the foundation is the Very Asian Foundation. It's just veryasianfoundation.org. And you can find us on social media the same way. And then the book, Gloo Books, GLOO, is where you can find the book, and it'll be in some boutique bookshops as well. And we'll be doing, some appearances and going around places. I hope to get up to Boston because that would be really neat. And then I would take you out for Korean lunch.
Okay. It's a date. It's a date. We've had a great time speaking to the author of A Very Asian Guide to Korean Food, Michelle Lee. Hey, Michelle, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be Dr. Michael Gurian. He'll be here to celebrate his young adult novel. It's called The Stone Boys. That's the next episode of the podcast. Hey, if you are the author of a fantastic children's book, please be sure to visit readingwithyourkids.com. Click on the Authors Click Here button at the top of the page to find out how we can help you tell the world all about your fantastic book. I want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, I want to start by thanking our guest, Michelle Lee. Please be sure to check out A Very Asian Guide to Korean Food. Also want to thank my team, Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Mirabella Q. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.